Who created God is a question quite frequently asked by atheists. On the surface, it may seem that this question poses a real problem for the Christian worldview because it cannot be answered. However, what I will show in this video is that the answer is actually pretty straightforward and simple. Not only that, but we will see that asking the atheist materialists a very similar question actually puts their worldview in real trouble. This is Lucas from Deflate, countering the skeptics' objections to Christianity. Click that subscribe button if you like my stuff, hit the bell and you'll get to see more videos like this one. Let's get started with some basics. Christianity holds that there exists both the universe and the God who is outside the universe. What is more, Christianity holds that God, rather than the universe, is ultimate, which means that He is the ground of all being. And so, what makes the question, who created God, so significant is that it asks for an explanation of that which Christianity holds to be the very bedrock of reality. Atheistic materialism, on the other hand, holds that the universe, the entirety of space, time, and matter, is all that exists. From this follows that the universe is atheistic materialism's ultimate bedrock of reality. And so one could say that asking a Christian who created God is the equivalent of asking an atheist materialist who or what created the universe. Both questions are inquiries into what the two worldviews hold to be ultimate. This brings us to our next issue, which is the distinction made in philosophy between things that exist contingently and things that exist necessarily. What does this mean? Well, to put it simply, a thing that exists contingently is a thing whose existence is explained by reference to another thing. A house exists because people built it. A flower exists because another flower got pollinated by a bee and generated a seed. And your smartphone exists because it was designed by Samsung or Apple and manufactured in Chinese sweatshops. Contrast that with things that exist necessarily, that is, things whose existence is explained not by a reference to something else, but by a reference to their own nature. There really aren't that many things in that category. The two most prominent ones are, first, mathematical entities, which many philosophers believe to exist by necessity of their own nature. The second one is God. In Christian theology, the term God describes an eternal, uncaused, and necessary being. Of course, God has other attributes too, but for our purpose here, that's enough. Eternal, uncaused, and necessary means that God is a being that exists outside of time, that He didn't begin to exist, that He is not created, that His existence has no cause outside Himself, but that He exists by the necessity of His nature. This means that God cannot not exist. It also means that He doesn't have an explanation outside Himself, but that God's existence is explained by His very own nature. Again, that's exactly what necessity as opposed to contingency means. Now, if God is an uncreated, necessary being, the question, who created God, turns out to be a nonsensical question. Why? Well, God does not belong to the class of things that are created, and therefore the question, who created God, is based on a category mistake. I mean, take this question, who is that bachelor's wife? The question doesn't make any sense because by definition, a bachelor doesn't have a wife. Or the question, what does the color red sound like? Same thing, it's a meaningless question because it's based on a confusion of categories. Colors, by definition, don't make sounds. God, by definition, is not created nor caused. That's why the question, who created God, is pointless. He is not a contingent but a necessary being. He exists by necessity of His own nature. Now, in contrast to God, who exists necessarily, the universe exists contingently. In other words, the universe does not explain itself because it does not exist by necessity of its own nature. Instead, the explanation of the universe must be found outside the universe. That's exactly why the famed Stephen Hawking said, "Why does the universe go to all the bother of existing?" He further admitted that science cannot answer the question of why there should be a universe. In other words, it really could have been the case that there was eternal nothingness, no universe, no nothing, and that you were not watching this YouTube video. But reality happened. Our contingent universe happened. In other words, everything that exists but didn't have to exist happened. And this cries out for an explanation. This is why the German philosopher Leibniz said that the most fundamental question of all is this: why is there something rather than nothing? Remember that the universe is the existence of all matter within space and time. Now here's the thing. Invoking the universe to explain the universe doesn't work. That's because the universe exists contingently, which is another way of saying that its explanation must lie in a thing other than the universe itself. But now also remember that according to the atheist materialist, the universe is all that exists. There is nothing beyond it. So what is the atheist materialist left with now to explain the universe? Well, basically nothing. That is quite literally nothingness. But we know that nothing cannot cause anything, and it certainly can't create anything of the magnitude and complexity of the universe. Even so, atheists offer exactly either of these two non-viable options, the universe itself or nothingness, as an explanation for our contingent universe. The former route is taken most prominently by Lawrence Krauss, who makes the case for a universe from nothing. There are, however, two fundamental problems with his hypothesis. First, he essentially redefines nothing to not mean nothing but a quantum vacuum, which is a rather obvious sleight of hand. Second, even if we granted his questionable move, this wouldn't solve anything. Instead, it would simply move the problem one step back, and one would have to find an explanation for his conjured up quantum vacuum, which, like the universe itself, exists contingently rather than necessarily. In the camp of those atheist materialists who invoke the universe itself to explain the universe, you have, for example, famous Oxford chemist Peter Atkins, who claims that space-time, that is the universe, generates its own dust in the process of its own self-assembly. Put simply, Atkins is saying that the universe creates itself. But this makes no sense, neither logically nor scientifically. I mean, just replace space-time in this quote with any other thing. An H2O molecule creates its own dust in the process of its own self-assembly. A rock creates its own dust in the process of its own self-assembly. A worm creates its own dust in the process of its own self-assembly. This is nonsense. No thing that comes into existence can cause itself, but everything that comes into existence is caused by something other than itself. And this applies to the universe as much as it applies to anything else. Thus, Atkins' statement is basically wishful thinking disguised as science, a cover-up for the fact that his atheistic materialism has absolutely no power to deliver an explanation for our universe, even though it cries out for one. So again, on atheistic materialism, all you have available to explain the universe are the universe itself and nothingness. But both are non-starters. Now, with no other option left, the materialist may take another route and say, well, the universe doesn't need an explanation, it just exists, that's all. In fact, that's exactly what Bertrand Russell said. The universe is just there, and that's all. But as even atheist philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer observed, it's nothing but a futile cop-out to try and exempt the universe from the need of an explanation about its cause, given that everything within the universe has a cause. Also note that looking for causal explanations is what the scientific method is all about, and therefore not looking for a causal explanation behind the universe, represents a rather anti-scientific attitude. Now, as I said in the beginning, what the question "who created God" is to Christianity is what "who created the universe" is to atheistic materialism. The inquiry into what is considered ultimate in each worldview. But here's the key difference. As we've just seen, atheistic materialism is incapable of accounting for what it poses to be ultimate, the universe. Nothingness cannot explain it, since nothing can come from nothing. Nor can the universe itself explain the universe, since its nature does not necessitate its existence. Things look rather different in Christian theism. The ground of all being, God, is not left unexplained. Instead, as a necessarily existing being, he is explained, similar to mathematical entities, not by reference to something else, but by reference to his own nature. Here then is the key difference between atheistic materialism and Christian theism. Materialism starts off with what exists contingently, the universe, and which must be explained by another thing that exists. Yet, materialism denies the existence of anything beyond the universe. Christianity, on the other hand, starts off with what exists necessarily, God. God, of course, is also in need of an explanation, which is exactly what the question "who created God" is about. But that explanation is available, and it lies in God's nature itself. That is, in the fact that God is, by definition, a being that exists necessarily. Now, at this point, the atheist may object and say, but what's your actual evidence for God? Saying that God is defined as a necessarily existing being doesn't actually mean that this God also exists. Great question. Well, one piece of evidence is the very issue we're talking about here. Let's recap. The universe didn't have to exist, but it happens that it does exist, which requires an explanation. By logical implication, the thing that explains the universe must necessarily be spaceless, timeless, and immaterial, lest it becomes part of what needs explaining. Basically, the two candidates fulfilling these criteria are numbers or unembodied minds. Numbers have no causal power, so they're out of the game. An unembodied divine mind, on the other hand, both fulfills these criteria and has causal powers. The atheist will, of course, respond and say, that's just a God of the gaps. I want scientifically verifiable evidence for the cause behind the universe. But there are various reasons why this response is problematic, to say the least. First, to demand scientifically verifiable evidence is to imply that the explanation of the universe must lie in an entity from the realm of physical matter. And that's because scientific inquiry does not and cannot extend beyond the realm of physical matter. But it's logically impossible to explain the universe, the entirety of matter within space-time, by reference to matter itself. Second, atheist materialists who reject the divine mind as an explanation for the universe because God is not a material entity are essentially putting up a circular argument, which goes something like this. Any viable explanation of the universe must refer to a material entity. The divine mind is not a material entity. Therefore, it is not a viable explanation of the universe. And that's because any viable explanation of the universe must refer to a material entity. So, one can use the God of the Gap soundbite as much as one pleases. However, I wonder whether this may be nothing but a distraction tactic, since it's quite obviously the atheist who is trying to sell us a materialism of the gaps by putting forward either nothingness or the universe itself as an explanation for our universe, or worse still, by asserting that no explanation needs to be given in the first place. Now, the very last move the materialist may make is to say that he or she withholds judgment because future evidence for a materialistic explanation might be forthcoming. But referring to alleged future evidence is logically fallacious, an argument from ignorance, and thus simply another expression of a materialism of the gaps. And by the way, who is to say that future evidence won't turn out to support a non-materialistic, theistic explanation of the universe? Be this as it may, as it stands, the worldview of atheistic materialism doesn't have anything to offer to explain the universe, whereas Christian theism does by postulating a necessarily existing divine mind. And this, in and of itself, is evidence for God and the plausibility of theism over and against atheism. So, to wrap it up, the question, who created God, poses no problem whatsoever for the Christian theist. If anything, the question and its answer shows that the Christian worldview is built on a solid philosophical foundation, as both its ultimate bedrock, God, and the universe are coherently explained. But once you return the favor and ask the atheist materialist the question about what or who created the universe, what is revealed is that atheistic materialism's ultimate bedrock of reality is left utterly unexplained. Thanks for watching. Do let me know what you think. Leave your comments below and subscribe and share my video if you liked it. And I hope to see you in the next episode. Bye.